reunion slash Q&A. This is a neat thing for us to be able to do. Of course, this territory is very important to this area, and we have a lot of the legends here. And we have a great two-man tag team to moderate this panel discussion. Mick Karch, right here, voice of Minnesota Wrestling, former host of Saturday Night Ringside Wrestling block in Minneapolis, ring announcer, color commentator for the AWA from 1987 to 88, play-by-play for numerous wrestling promotions throughout the country, Mick Karch. Schire award-winning wrestling historian, James C. Melody Historian Award winner at the 2013 Cauliflower Alley Club Reunion, author of Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, a great look at the history of pro wrestling in that state, wrestling fan and collector for 5+ decades, George Schire. These guys know what they're talking about with this, and have fun. We hope to Q&A with you, George Schire.
Okay, before we talk to the AWA guys, I've been informed that to my left, a very special guest. This is Lynn Taylor Lawrence, and she is the widow of the great Chris Taylor. And we're going to have a microphone. Chris is just a great competitor, you know, a great amateur, and sadly his career as a professional wrestler kind of shortchanged a little bit, cut short, but say a few words, please.
Good afternoon. I was married to Chris. We were married in '73. He became a professional wrestler at that time when we moved to Minneapolis. And then in, I'm not sure exactly, he wrestled for 3 to 5 years, and he passed away on June 30th, 1979 at the age of 29. And we had one daughter, Jenny, who's here somewhere. And she's now a 30-some-year-old. And she works in Chicago for Walgreens Corporation, so she's doing well. And I've remarried and have been remarried for 29 years and have another daughter who's standing in the doorway. And if anybody has any questions about Chris, I should also tell you that last year Chris was inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame in Stillwater, Oklahoma. And we were here in 2005 when he was inducted into the Iowa Wrestling Hall of Fame when it was at Newton. And we live in Chris's hometown, which I married a gentleman that was a friend of Chris's. And we've lived there for 29 years plus. And there's also, we have the longest running display in the City Hall with all of Chris's things. And they just built a new Southwest Michigan, because we're from Michigan, Southwest corner, a museum in town. It's called the Southwest Michigan Museum, and we had enough things to go into that museum. So counting Iowa State's Hall of Fame when he was inducted in 1999, we've got Chris's things in 5 different museums, and this is Chris's daughter here. Chris is very well represented in the state of Iowa, also in Oklahoma, and also in Michigan, and it's great to come back because I always thought Iowa was my second home.
And I don't know how many of you remember when Chris Taylor was working in the AWA, but the old opening to the AWA TV show back on film had kind of 4 scenes, kind of a split screen, and then at the very end of the program, there you had Chris Taylor in his debut match, and he had Renee Goulet in a bear hug, and Renee was flailing away a little bit, and so that's out there on YouTube someplace, I'm sure.
Oh, it's all over YouTube.
And from what I met Chris a couple of times, and you know, a 400-pound teddy bear. I mean, just the nicest guy in the world. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we introduce our illustrious panel here, I want to have George give a little explanation, a little history of the AWA. First of all, of the people that are here, how many actually grew up in an AWA city? Okay, not too bad. How many have no idea what the AWA was at all? Okay, we got a good start. George is a historian par excellence. I mean, this guy, I've had the pleasure, or maybe the misfortune, of going to his home once in a while, and he's got everything in file cabinets, books, programs, result sheets. If you want to know a fact about wrestling that you really don't need to know, George Schire is the guy that will give it to you. But George, talk a little bit about the history of the AWA.
Thank you, Mick Karch. The AWA, for those that do not know, and some of you that do know, was officially started in August of 1960. And the way it came about was originally what was called the old Minneapolis Territory. It's only old because it's so long ago. But that is what they call it today, the old Minneapolis Territory. And it was NWA promoted, the National Wrestling Alliance. Vern Gagne, who basically pulled away from the NWA for championship purposes, wanted to become the world champion, started his own company, and the real long story short is that they created a fictitious storyline in May of 1960, basically saying that if the current NWA champion, Pat O'Connor, at the time, did not defend his title to the #1 challenger, Vern Gagne, that the AWA would take title recognition away from Pat O'Connor. Now, Pat O'Connor was never AWA champion, just the NWA champion. Well, as I said, it was a storyline. It was never going to happen at the time. There was no match to be planned. 90 days went by. The story said that Pat O'Connor and the NWA failed to meet the challenge, and Vern Gagne was the new world champion. And that started in August of 1960. Basically a small company from the beginning, but started working around the Midwest, eventually into Winnipeg, Canada, down to Denver, out San Francisco, just continued to grow. With that behind it, Vern Gagne was basically the on-again, off-again champion for much of the 1960s, with some great champions off and on. Dr. Bill Miller, who was working as masked man Mr. M. Big Thunder Gene Kiniski was an AWA champion in the early 60s, 1961. And then what Vern did was have a core of wrestlers who not only he trained through the years, brought into the business, but also a good core of guys that worked at the beginning of the 60s. Great stars like Wilbur Snyder, Leo Namalini, and you name it, it's a who's who. Gene Kiniski, as I said, and Bill Miller, Hard-Boiled Haggerty, Len Montana, Stan Crusher Kowalski, Tiny Mills, all very, very big names in the business. As the 60s progressed, the AWA became basically known as the #2 promotion in the wrestling business, next to the NWA, and then at the time we had the WWWF. Or as Barron often says, the WWWWF, when he talks about it. But throughout the 60s, great, great superstars, and we're going to have a few of them talk with you here today. There's some guys that I always refer to as mainstays in the AWA, the guys that made the AWA. And of course you can throw Gagne out there, but there are guys that were sometimes bigger names. The Crusher Lisowski, Dick the Bruiser, and one of the greatest tag teams of all time. I remember it from the 60s, I know Mick does. Starting in October of 1964, when Larry Pretty Boy Hennig announced his partner Handsome Harley Race, and they basically for the next 4 years headlined all over, tag team champions 3 times, and just obviously one of the greatest teams of the 60s, and I think of all time. And I don't say that because he's sitting over here. I say it because it's fact. They did great business for the AWA. And then we moved into the 60s. From the 60s, we had Baron von Raschke start out as a rookie, trained by Vern Gagne, and got into the business as Jim Raschke. And I think Mr. Raschke says this himself, as Jim Raschke was very boring. But when Mad Dog Vachon worked with him a little bit, brought out that character, that Baron character, and he became a huge heel in the 70s, the late 60s, and one of the biggest names in the business. Another guy that we don't want to forget here the one that crushes apples, breaks pliers in the mid-60s. One of the few times that the AWA continually brought in their NWA champion, junior heavyweight champion, and that's Danny Hodge. And to this day, you don't want to get Danny mad at you because you might go home without an arm or something. And then I'm going to give it back to Mick. As we go through this, if there's any questions you have about the AWA, we'll be glad to answer them. Thank you.
Got to introduce everybody on the panel here because I tell you, look at the smorgasbord of wrestling talent. To my immediate right, I'm telling you, first of all, he's a guy that never ages. You look at him, you look at a picture from 1974, same face, same everything. Without a doubt, the best drop kick in the history of wrestling, jumping Jimmy Brunzell, ladies and gentlemen. And a man that George mentioned a little bit earlier on, you know, former AWA announcer Roger Kent used to say this guy was big enough and tough enough to go bear hunting with a switch. And he certainly is, and I tell you what, you talk about the mainstays in the history of the AWA, you go all the way back to 1962, right up through the 80s. And this man was a part of the AWA, kind of, you know, went to other territories now and then. But I tell you what, if there's a legend in this business associated with the AWA, it's Larry the Axe Hennig. George mentioned Danny Hodge a little bit. Danny was not a regular in the AWA, but he would come in periodically. I remember a series of matches that he had with a local guy by the name of Eddie Schire, who of course went on to train guys like Barry Darso and the Road Warriors and a guy named Jesse Ventura. But Danny Hodge would come in as the NWA junior heavyweight champion, and I know a couple of times he came in, teamed up with guys like Rene Goulet and the Crusher. We didn't get enough of Danny Hodge as far as I'm concerned, but Tool, man, you talk to anybody in the wrestling business about the one guy you don't want to mess with, and that's Danny Hodge. And there, next to him, now not only has he been a professional wrestling superstar, but in the state of Minnesota, I believe he was voted by the University of Minnesota, what are you, like class president or something, Mayor? Something like that. He's done pizza commercials. This guy's done everything there is to do. But certainly one of the familiar faces, and I know Barron has often said that he's just this side of Brad Pitt when it comes to facial recognition out there. The clawmaster himself, Baron von Raschke. And last but certainly not least, now this guy, you know, I guess they call him enhancement talent these days in wrestling, the likes of the Kenny Jays and George Scrap Iron Gadowskis in the world. And it's interesting because if you talk to a fan who kind of went away from the wrestling business for a while, they'll say, hey, whatever happened to Larry Hennig, Harley Race, Jim Brunzell, and somehow or other they say, what happened to that milkman guy? Here's a man, you know, you can talk about winning championships, you can talk about traveling the world, but there's only one guy at this table, at this round table, that won a turkey on a pole match from Colonel De Beers. There's only one guy here who Jesse gave a break to. There's only one guy that got screwed out of $1 million by Larry Zbyszko. And he's right there, ladies and gentlemen, Jake the Milkman Milliman. And Jake, if you weren't at the wrestling show last night, Jake wrestled, and I tell you what, you're still doing that flying headbutt, Jake, from the top rope. The difference between now and the 80s, you connected last night. Back in the, I remember Nick pile driving you. I thought you would never come out of the mat back in about 83. Going to start with Jim Brunzell here as we talk about the AWA. Jim, you're one of the guys who made the transition going from the AWA to the then WWF. And my question to you, I guess, is twofold. First of all, how did the office take your, you know, splitting, going to the WWF back in the day? And of the two territories, AWA and WWF, which was your favorite?
Well, Mick, you know, at that time, you know, I had been Greg's partner since '74. I went away for a little bit to North Carolina, then came back and had just huge success in the 80, 81, all the way until Hulk Hogan left. When Hulk Hogan left the AWA and Vince McMahon started his purge of the 24 various promotions throughout the U.S. and sucking all of the talent there, and it was almost impossible for the AWA to succeed. Not only did Hulk leave, but Bobby Heenan left, Rick Martel, Jesse, and what had happened was the attendance was declining. So, as Greg's partner, I thought that there might be an opportunity for me to get a guaranteed contract with Vern, a personal guarantee. So I had a meeting with Vern and I asked for a sum that I thought I was worthy of, and Vern looked me in the face and he said, "You're not worth it." So the next week I started in New York. I never looked back. New York was a completely different circumstance. Vince McMahon had a totally different idea of what his concept was of professional wrestling, how it drew fans. He didn't have any rhyme or reason to his matches. He just created different stars that he could project, so they in turn could have t-shirts, lunch buckets, pencils made, and the money just kept coming in. When I left in 1985, for 3.5 years, my partner Brian Blair and I, the Killer Bees, wrestled on an average of 27 days a month for 3 years. Vince had 60 individuals, probably some of the top talent in wrestling, and he had 3 towns a night, and there was 20 guys in each town. So we were constantly, every 2 weeks we'd get a deal from the FedEx, and you get plane tickets this thick. So you pack your bags, you'd be gone for 2 weeks, come home for 3 days, get your laundry, relax, hug your wife, hug your kids, and then get back on the plane. And this continually happened. So I was spoiled when I first started in the AWA. It was the best territory to work. As I said in the other room, there was 12 to 14 guys that compromised, that made up the AWA, and in so doing, everybody knew their own position, everybody made good money, and you had time off to enjoy it. So, to me, there was no comparison.
Next question, I guess, coming from George, is for Larry Hennig.
Thanks, Mick. Larry, you also, as I mentioned earlier, were an AWA mainstay for the most part. We talk about the travel in the wrestling business and how grueling it was for most of the guys that were in the business. A lot of times in the 60s, still in the 70s, a lot of it by car. And one of the questions that I get asked by fans a lot was, as I mentioned, Larry Hennig was so good in the ring and so great on the microphone, whether you were a heel or a babyface, you always were very effective. And one of the questions I get is, why didn't Larry Hennig do more traveling to outside territories? And you could have been a big star in any territory that you chose just because of the talent and the likability that you had.
I certainly had the opportunity to do that. I could have went anywhere and wrestled at one time, but I'd rather been a star at home than a star on the road. And we raised 5 children. We now have 23 grandchildren, thanks to my beautiful wife, Irene. In October, we celebrate our 58th year of marriage. I will be 78 on my next birthday. Look pretty good, don't I? I would like to go back to, I like the AWA. It was good to me, but there's one guy I didn't like, and that was Vern. And I've said it then and I'll say it now. And when Vince came into the AWA, when he was expanding, he came in and had a meeting with Vern Gagne and said, I'm going to give you $15 million, some astronomical amount of money, and you can either change it more, let's make a deal. And Vern said, you know what, you are never going to get Minneapolis, you're never going to get Winnipeg, you're never going to get Wisconsin, you're not going to go into Illinois, you're not going to go into Denver, Colorado, etc., etc. And Vince left. He said, okay. The following Monday, a week from that day, Vince had the television in Minneapolis. He asked to buy him out, he wouldn't do it, so Vince came in and just took it over. So it wasn't a matter that he didn't have a chance. But the trouble with Vern Gagne is he had a saying, once you're poor, you're never rich. No matter how much he made, was never enough for this guy. And that's what finally, that's the creature that came at AWA. It was Vern's own fault, his own greed, because he had a chance at that time to make a lot of money and retire. Is that it?
That's it.
Before we go on to Danny Hodge, Larry, I know we're talking about the history of the AWA, but I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about a guy from about 1987 that I had the opportunity to work with when he was the AWA heavyweight champion, and that's Curt Hennig. And as great as Curt was back in '87 on top of the AWA, of course his best days were ahead of him, and now the legacy is continuing with Joe Hennig, who's finally getting the recognition that he deserves in the WWE. Talk a little bit about the legacy. You've done good, my friend.
We have 3 generations. As a matter of fact, I was inducted into this Hall of Fame in '06, and Curt was inducted in '07. We were the first father and son to be inducted into this great Hall of Fame. These people are super people, good attitudes. They got a good basic wrestling background and foundation. So I'm in love with this association. Now, let's talk about the next one of my next generation, one of my grandsons. His name now is called Curtis, which is his middle name, and Axel, and people all know who that is, right? Okay. And his name now is Curtis Axel. He just signed a multi-contract with the WWE. He's a great athlete, he's got a great attitude, he's got a beautiful wife, he's got 2 beautiful boys, and he's doing great, and he loves every minute of it. And let me just say this too, that about Curt, the boy we lost. I don't have bad days. My wife and I have bad minutes, but one's coming on now every time I talk about it. But the point is that life goes on, and he was a great athlete, and I'm proud of each and every one of my children and my grandchildren are all involved in athletics. So that's all.
Talked about this too, and I guess I got in on the tail end of what the AWA is doing when I came in '87, but I did have the opportunity to work with Curt Hennig. And I tell you what, as far as I'm concerned, in the modern era, there was nobody that could outperform Curt. And Larry, I want you to know that. I mean, he was the real deal, and in my estimation, one of the greatest of all time, not just in the modern era.
I think what we just heard coming from Larry Hennig and even Jim Brunzell, they touched on this a little bit when we talked about the travel and staying in a territory. One of the things that I'm sure all of the gentlemen here would agree that traveling and being on the road and working different territories. Some of the guys only stayed in a territory for 6 months to a year, maybe a year and a half tops. Then they were on the road to another territory. And it really, really took its toll on not only them personally, but it took a toll on marriages and family life. And I think it's really a credit when we look at guys like Jim Brunzell and Larry Hennig who sit here and say that family came first. And I will tell you that I think that's the most important thing in life, because after family, there's nothing. So I congratulate both of them and think it's great. Mr. Barron, you too, sir. Although I will say this, we know that Barron did a lot more traveling during the years in the business than, Larry and Jim did. Because Barron was in Toronto, he was in Detroit, he was in the WWF, he was in Texas, he was in Florida, and just basically carved out a legendary career. Worked for the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder in Indianapolis, and he was legendary as a heel, and then basically finally getting the chance to come home. But he had the blessings of his great wife that he always refers to as Mrs. Claw, but that's Bonnie, and they have just a beautiful family as well, and I've had the pleasure of meeting his son and daughter, and they're great people. So Barron, congratulations to you too. Danny, before we go any further, I want to ask you one question. I had mentioned earlier that you had worked briefly for the AWA off and on in the early 60s, 64, 65, you'd come in. You were never billed as the NWA World Champion, though you were at the time. You were just called the NW, or the Junior Heavyweight Champion. But I'd like to get your take on how it was to come in and have the working relationship that you did with Vern Gagne at the time.
Well, it was a great pleasure. I never thought I'd ever do anything like this. I wrestled in junior high and high school, 2 years in the Navy, made the Olympics 52, Helsinki, Finland, 56, I made both freestyle and Greco with Melbourne, Australia, and I let another boy wrestle with Greco so he could make a trip to the Olympics Australia. But I met a wonderful young lady, had beautiful brown eyes, and I fell in love. And we've been married 61 years. Good average. And I got to probably go around the world at least 40 times. Never thought I'd ever see anything but just dust in Oklahoma. But through wrestling and boxing, I've had the privilege of traveling the world. And my wife, who had 3 beautiful children, Dan Jr., and a daughter Linda, and another son Michael. And fortunately, they all live at home, thank God. So, what a pleasure it's been for me traveling the world. I never thought I'd ever get to go to Hawaii. I went there on the way to the Olympics in Australia. But I got to wrestle there. I've got to go around the world, I guess, 48 times. I never thought I'd see anything but just dust in Oklahoma. But it's been a real pleasure to wrestle with Vern and all these young men, most all these young men here over the years. It's been a pleasure for me. I wondered how I was going to wrestle some of these big young men. I guess I was trying to get out and run. But it's been a real pleasure for me to travel and be an honor to be in this great museum. So Any questions, I'll be glad to answer.
Well, the next guy down there, if you live in the state of Minnesota, he's such a fixture. I mean, you know, he still makes all these appearances at the indie shows. You know, he's one of the first guys that the promoters ask for when, you know, when they're looking for a legend to come in and sign autographs and what have you. And going back to the 1970s, Baron von Raschke, you teaming up with the dog, so hated, so vicious and so vile, and that just blows me away that a guy, seriously, and this is, I guess, part of my question, a guy with your demeanor, you're the nicest guy in the world. I don't know how you turned on that switch, that on-off switch. Of course, you couldn't see where you were going. I think that was part of it back in the day. You're a little nearsighted. But that to me is such a talent, Baron. And as George said a little bit earlier on, the last years in the AWA as a crowd favorite, I want to ask you first of all, which did you prefer, wrestling as a heel or taking it a little the safer route as a crowd favorite back in the day? And also, as a guy who was in the business as long as you were, what was the high and the low for you as far as your tenure in the AWA?
What? In the first place, I was never a bad guy. Ask Mrs. Club. I was sadly misunderstood the first 15 years or so. There I was, born in West Germany. That's just the other side of the Missouri River in Omaha, Nebraska. So my credentials are firm and secure. And how I ever became this person, Baron von Raschke, I have no idea. I never for a minute dreamed about it. Danny Hodge and the Oklahoma Sooners came to my school, the University of Nebraska. I hear you. Came to the University of Nebraska to wrestle. And I was too shy to go over and say hi or ask for an autograph. I was too shy to say hi to anybody. I like to be left alone. I loved wrestling, so I did a lot of it. But somehow, until I met a fellow by the name of Maurice Mad Dog Vachon, and he thought that I would make a good German, but we released that alter ego that becomes Baron von Raschke so easily and so joyfully, who can speak and communicate and get ideas across. Chris Taylor was not a 400-pound cuddly bear. He was a grizzly bear, a monster. I attacked Chris Taylor, and I faced him man to man, and I grabbed him. Once, I grabbed him twice, I grabbed him 3 times, and finally I faced him again. It took that long to get around again. But he was one of the nicest guys I've ever met also. So, anyway, I forgot what we were talking about. The AWA, I always came home to the AWA because they're the people that started me, Vern Gagne, Wally Cabo, Joe Casisto, and all the guys, the Kenny Jays, and all the guys that came in and took little Jimmy Raschke and helped him out, gave him advice, showed him different things to do. I owe my whole career to everybody. Jake Millman, all those guys that came, made the TVs, made the stars look good. Thank you. We really appreciate it. It takes a lot of people to make a Baron von Raschke. And that brings us to the milkman.
You have a question? You want to interject something here? Or are we going right to the milkman? All right. Jake Millman. First of all, let's talk about when Jesse Ventura decided that he was going to give Jake a break. And you teamed up with Jesse, I believe it was a feud with the Fabulous Ones, if I recall, back in the day. And you said that right in the middle of this big run, you were going to go around the country. Jesse left and went to the WWE. So you kind of went back to the drawing board after that. But that wasn't the end of it for you. You had the infamous turkey on a pole match with Colonel LeVere's. I mean, that really is something. You got a turkey 10 feet in the air with a pole up its rear end. And of course, you were wrestling in the secured, pink curtained AWA studios back in the day. Just talk about some of those memories, Jake.
Yeah, back in those days, Bert didn't clue you in on a lot that was going on. You would just show up to the building and he would say, "This is what we're doing today," and you would just go do it. I had no idea that match was coming up. I had no clue of what we were going to do. The Bears was in one dressing room. I was in a different dressing room. You just went out in the ring and did it. And that's just how it came out. But Bert did a lot of things, I don't want to say strange, but he had his own way of doing things. You were in the dark a lot. But no, it was enjoyable. The guys were all, it was a great, it was more like, it's not been brought up tonight, but it was more like a family. Everyone had everybody else's back. If you did something wrong in the ring, they would come and tell you.
Don't do that again.
Yeah. Yeah, so you could get hurt, or you could hurt yourself. And it was more like a family in the AWA than a cutthroat, like a lot of the other areas, where they ain't gonna tell you nothing, because they don't want you to take their spot down the road. And just like it was mentioned before, everybody has a slot. You know what that slot is, and you fulfill it to your best. And yeah, other than that, just you're right. The traveling was grueling. I mean, you'd be on the road for days, just driving. You literally had to fall in love with the highway to stay with it. The highway was your friend. And other than that, I got one little cute story that I'd like to share with everyone. Larry will remember this one. They had brought in a guy from Germany by the name of Otto. And we were traveling together. It was Larry, myself, and Otto. And we got back into town. We were hubbing out of Milwaukee. And we decided, oh, we'll stop and get something to eat. So we all ordered our food. And we're just talking about the nice match, just like we always do. And our food comes, and Larry and I begin to eat. All of a sudden, we look over, and here's Otto. He's got this plate of spaghetti right up underneath his chin. He's got this fork, and I mean, he's just shoveling it in. And I looked at Larry, and Larry looked at me, and he says, "Jake, you believe that's our champion?"
I believe it. I'll hand the mic back to Mick. I think this thing is open to questions, so think of some questions. Ask Jake.
I know, George, you've got one last question for Larry Hennig, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions from you people. But I have to kind of echo what Larry and Baron have said tonight. They're not appreciated enough. The Jake Millimans and the Kenny Jays and the George Kadaskis and the Santiago Acostas, if you go back that far, as far as the enhancement talent, they do their best, they do their damnedest, they get the crap kicked out of them so many times to get the stars over. And they're an unappreciated commodity in wrestling. In the Twin Cities and the AEW, wrestling's changed so much. You don't see the what they call the squash matches on television anymore. Everything is a main event match. But back in the day, you had your 2 out of 3 fall matches with, Larry Hennig and Harley Race against, Kenny J and whoever. And those kind of guys, like the Millimans of the world, my hat is off to them because they never got the credit that they deserved. But it's funny, when you talk about wrestling, like I said before, and people will say to you, whatever happened to Jake Milliman, whatever happened to Kenny J. So the people remember, and Jake is the only representative of that ilk in professional wrestling. I want to thank you for a job well done. Thank you so much.
One of the most entertaining parts of the old wrestling era, the old school days, the kayfabe era, we got a little bit of a touch of it when we saw Jim Raschke metamorphose into the Baron von Raschke. And what was really interesting about those days is that, as Mick talks about those squash matches, it was the time that the wrestlers got to the microphone in the interview area to put over their opponent or talk about their match that night, their upcoming feud, to continue the story. And we know how good the Baron was at it. And I'm not here to put Larry on the spot, but I was wondering, Larry, because I had alluded to earlier how good you were on the mic, I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of a sample of either, you can pick which side, Larry Pretty Boy Hennig or Larry the Axe Hennig, but talk about a match coming up in Winnipeg against Vern Gagne. Tell us about how you're going to take care of Vern Gagne.
Kind of promo, Larry, is what he's...
Larry Hennig fashion.
Well, I never liked the son of a bitch anyway, so. And whatever I said about him, I meant. I mean, I had a match with him, and he said, "Oh, Larry, you weigh I weighed 330 then, and I'm down to 229 now." But I threw him in a corner, and I come in with a knee and hit him in the ribs, and I fractured 3 of his ribs. That was one of my high spots in my career. And as he was going down, he says, "You finally," short hair, "you finally got me, you fat prick." That was the nicest thing that he said to me all the time in the AWA. Except one time, I can tell you. They moved to a new wrestling office, and he was giving me some crap, and I went up there and I tore the wrestling office apart. I mean, I was really mad at this guy he owed Kurt money, a long story. So I go to the wrestling office to pick up my check for that week. I was on the road back and forth. You go in and pick up your money. Do you know what he did? He wrote me a check with a 0 on it and gave it to me. How do you like that? I worked all week and he gave me a check with a 0. I never got over that either. But I would say if I were to wrestle Vern Gagne, I would say that, relating to that my interview would have followed those lines. Whatever I said about him, I've never changed my mind. I met, and there's one guy that, I gotta tell you what I did. When I came back as the Axe from New York, this is an interesting story, and really got over big with the Axe. Larry the Axe, I mean, that was the biggest thing that ever happened to me. And so I had some bumper stickers made, and we were at TV, and I put the bumper stickers on Vern's car. Said, "The Axe is back on the bumper," all over the bumper. And he got there and he said, "Boy, them people are sure like wrestling." He said, "They've been honking at me all day long." He said, "Well, you son of, No, but all in all, I guess it's been quite a trip. I'm still in the real estate and auction business, been a little slow. but we're going ahead with it, and I really want to thank you people that you've taken your time and your weekend, your money, and on your own to come down here and be here with us, and for all of us, we want to thank you for doing that.
Okay, it's your turn now. The panel is ready. I know Brunzell's ready to go. He's ready. So anybody who has a question for anybody up here, this illustrious panel, if you just raise your hand. Yes, sir.
I'm going to relay a story more than it's good. It's part question. One of you already has heard this story last night. 1975 to 1980s, that circle. The AWA was coming into Davenport, Iowa, Holy, Illinois, and they were wrestling under the stars at the baseball park there in town. On one particular night, Baron von Raschke was there, and it just so happened that Greg Downey was also there. I don't know if Jim was there or not. But before the match ended, the AWA Heavyweight Championship belt disappeared. Now, here's my question. I heard how it was returned. Somebody tried to bail it back to him. My question is, it was inferred that there was several $1,000s worth of jewels stolen out of that belt. What was the real value? Nearly, you might guess.
Trying to pawn them off Powerball.
I didn't get near what I should have.
Jim, you were kind of the AWA accountant for a while. What was the value of the AWA belt? I know Vern said it was about $10,000.
You know, I really don't know. You know, the one that Nick had, he still has. Nick Bockwinkel, his World Championship belt, I used to say it was so big that I remember Nick sent all of his slacks into the tailor so he could make his belt to fit that belt so he could wear it around all the time. But I think it was probably in that vicinity. I know the tag team belts were copper inlaid, and they were probably $1,500 to $2,000.
So Stan Hansen might have done a little damage to that belt a little bit later on with the truck.
He's probably got the original.
Okay. Next question. Tim?
Well, you mentioned Leo Nominelli before, and as under my understanding, right, he played football, and then during the offseason he wrestled with the AWA, he was a tag team champion. What was that like in like the mainstream media and the fans? Because the NFL obviously would be a lot different today, and a lot of us fans weren't around in the 60s, and so if anyone has any info, what was he a bigger star in wrestling? Did the NFL acknowledge that? Was there a good working relationship? Anything you can tell me that would be?
I think, Tim, the thing that you have to first realize that wrestling and football back in the early 60s, the late 50s, was a lot different as far as paydays and the way it was, contracts, etc. And with a guy like Leo Nominelli, who had a great football career, there were a lot of wrestlers that would wrestle on the off season to start with. You know, when you talk about football players that came into wrestling, eventually they came in full time. Most of them of the day said they turned over full time to wrestling because they made more money. And, you know, when you have names like Nominelli and Ernie Ladd and Wahoo McDaniel, to name some of them, they were all former football stars. But with Nominelli, and I noticed how you stumbled over his name, that was like a Wally Carbo right there. And of course, we all know that Bobby Heenan used to come out and say that Nominelli, it looks like an eye chart, was one of his greater lines. But to answer your question, Leo Nominelli was really big in wrestling, a lot more in the West Coast, San Francisco area. In fact, he even was recognized as heavyweight champion for a while after some matches with Lou Thez. But I think that answers your question. It was more money for a wrestler to come into, or a football player to come into wrestling because they made more money in those days. Sometimes they could make $6,000 a year playing football, unheard of in today's standards. But in wrestling, they could do a lot better, and eventually they made the transition.
They can make 6,500.
Before this breaks up, I would like to, no one's asked me, but I'm gonna say it anyway, I have a habit of that. But the greatest champion that I think, that I met in my career, in my generation and before, a true gentleman, and his wife is here with us now, Charlie. To me, the greatest representative in the world as a world champion was Luthez. He was a great wrestler, he was a great gentleman, he was a great champion, and I just want to make you people aware of how myself and my family and a lot of the wrestlers do feel about that. Thank you.
My question's for Jim, and
Yes.
of course, my favorite tag team was the High Flyers.
Thank you.
But I would like to know which of the two teams was your favorite, the High Flyers or the Killer Bees, and why?
Well, it was totally different in New York because there was no emphasis on tag teams. They had, like I said, they had so many guys and they just threw guys together in order to make the different towns add up to 8 matches or 10 matches. I achieved more success with Greg because of the fact that there was actually, the talent that we had here was so enormous. I mean, when you think of the talent that was in the AWA, granted, there was some stars like Jack Briscoe, who was wonderful, Terry and Dory Funk, Harley Race, and you know, he had some guys on the East Coast that were great, and down in Florida. But consistently, the AWA had the greatest wrestling talent that could perform in the ring, and people would watch and they'd say, geez, that's an art. This is an art of professional wrestling. And when Greg and I wrestled as a team, we had guys that we worked with on a nightly basis, like Ray Stevens, Nick Bockwinkel, Bobby Duncan, I'm not going to say Jack Lanza, but some other, even Jesse and Adrian Adonis. And because we knew our positions and didn't have to worry about, you know, somebody else sort of cutting your back tires and trying to leapfrog you, everybody had, I think there was very few times where Greg and I, whoever it was, had a bad match. Whereas when you went to the WWF, you were on the road so much, they didn't care if they had a good match. You know, a lot of them just put in their time, and it sort of frustrated a lot of guys that were used to it, you know, trying to have a good match. So without a doubt, and Brian Blair was a good partner. You know, he's a good friend of Hulk Hogan's, but if you're in a situation and you're constantly trying to get over with a promoter like Vince McMahon, and you realize right off the bat you ain't going to do it, you got to stop. So I think that the fact that Brian and I continued, you know, trying to get his favor never worked. So without a doubt, you know, Brian was a great partner, but Greg and I had great success.
Yes, Jeff.
Just one more for Jim. Talk about having your spot within the AWA as a tag team champion and so forth. Can you talk about when you went to the Carolinas? Was that something that you felt you needed to do to become known as a singles contender versus when you moved to with Vince later on?
Well, I said this in the other room when I'd been Greg's partner for about 5 years, and I realized I wasn't going to go any further than being a tag team partner. So I had an opportunity to go down to North Carolina, which was a great opportunity for me. Gave me an opportunity to work as a single. And I had a lot of great matches down there with Ric Flair, and they had some tremendous talent down there. You know, Flair, they had Paul Orndorff, Ricky Steamboat, Kenny Patera. I don't know if Cosmo Waziri was a great talent, but he drew pretty well for me. It was harder than hell to work with, but and I will say this about the Mid-Atlantic, he wrestled, George Scott didn't believe in time off, so he wrestled 7 days a week, and then in the summer he wrestled twice on Saturday and twice on Sunday. The only benefit in Charlotte was you could get home every night, you know, be it at 1 o'clock so you could spend time with your family, which was a lot different when, you know, I went to New York. Thanks.
Yes?
Getting back to the subject of football players, a quick question, I guess, for Jim, since you were involved in it back in 1986 at WrestleMania 2.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about behind the scenes, how easy it was to work with football players? Was there any tension between the wrestlers and football players, and how that went down?
Well, you know, Vince, now this was his whole philosophy. When they had the Battle Royal in Chicago and they had a number of the Bears there, they sort of segregated them from us. They weren't really outgoing. They didn't want to learn more about. They were there for the money and, you know, for the just being in the wrestling match. I will say this though, later on in WrestleMania, when you had Bam Bam Bigelow wrestling Lawrence Taylor, and Vince McMahon let Lawrence Taylor beat a pro wrestler in, you know, a WrestleMania, I thought was absolutely disgusting and disgraceful, because there's no pro football player who's going to let a pro wrestler run for a touchdown, I'll tell you that. So I didn't agree with that. The football players who were in pro wrestling, when I was there, I had an opportunity to work with Ernie Ladd. Wahoo McDaniel was a great talent. Jesus. He was tough and a mean son of a gun, too. And, you know, I think that, what was the question again? I sort of got carried away.
In that particular match, there's been stories that some of the football players didn't want to cooperate with some of the wrestlers that day, and maybe they wanted to turn it into something that other than it was.
If that was the case, I didn't know of it. Okay. You know, they were friendly. You know, they'd shake your hand, and they had refrigerator Perry there too, but they just sort of did what they had to do, and they were sort of told, you know, you're going to go out here, going to go out there, and that was it.
Yes?
Hey, I got a question for Jim. When there was a change in the guard man in the AWA with the tag teams when Crusher and Bruiser had that run, and then you guys were there, and then they brought in the Road Warriors. I know you guys worked the Road Warriors, and they kind of ran roughshod over everybody. Can you just tell a story what it was like working with those two guys?
Well, the Road Warriors were a totally different breed, because they were in the era when I believe they got really a big push down in Atlanta with Ole. And he created a team that he wanted to be. Somebody that could say whatever they wanted and then go in the ring and beat the crap out of everybody without selling. And consequently, they created a hell of a team, but I guarantee you it wasn't easy going in the ring with them, because they didn't want to give you anything, you know? And I know I know for a fact though, there was a couple times, I think they were in New York, and we had a fellow in New York by the name of Haku, and his name was Fafita, and he was from the island of Tonga, and he was probably, without a doubt, one of the most fierce and probably one of the most toughest guys in the ring. I mean, he's a street fighter. He'd bite your nose off, everything, he'd poke your eye out, which he did. And when the Road Warriors were with him, it was a different story. So, you know, more power to Mike, you know, and I'm sorry that he passed away at a young age, but Mike and Joe, you know, they did it great. I think it was advantageous for them. They created a different air, but it was like pulling teeth without Novocaine.
I think we're getting the wrap up. Before we go, I just want to say something as a longtime AWA fan, and I know I speak for George. You know, we're going back to 1960 or whatever. These gentlemen and the whole list of people who came before them, and even, you know, a handful that came after them, when the AWA shut its doors, it was really painful for guys like George and I. I mean, this is a legacy. This is all we knew growing up, and we thought too that for a long time Vern was going to hang in there with it. and that eventually the WWE would just give up and tuck tail and go. But on behalf of myself and George and anybody else who watched the AWA, I can't thank you guys enough. You were part of my childhood, you're part of my adulthood, and you're real life heroes, all of you.